A few years ago, I read about a courtroom case that shook a small town. A young man had caused a fatal accident while driving drunk. The courtroom was tense, everyone waiting for the victim's father to demand maximum sentence. When it was his turn to speak, the father stood, his voice cracked, but his words stunned the room. Justice must be served, but I also forgive him. I do not want his life destroyed. I want him to have the chance to change. The judge, shaking, handed down a balanced sentence. Accountability, yes, but also a pathway for rehabilitation.
That father embodied what the law was meant to reflect. Not reckless vengeance, not unchecked freedom, but justice tempered with mercy.
Hi there, it's Q3E9, and today we explore the topic Living the Law. Let's get into it. Today, I will be skipping the key object lessons. I need you instead to drop in the comment section what ministered to you the most. You ready? Let's do this. If you recall, in Exodus 20, we witnessed God reel out the terms of his covenant relationship with his people at Sinai. We also established that these laws are generally applicable to all who sign up to walk with God even today. But the principles of the law needed to be applied in everyday life, meaning it had to address the local realities of each audience. They had to land in real life, in businesses, in family disputes, in the mess where justice and mercy collide.
And so in Exodus 21, God gave them, that Sinai audience, what we call the Code of the Covenant.
Case studies, real scenarios.
Judges were appointed to apply the principles of God's law, not just recite them. This wasn't just about memorizing commandments, it was about living them. It was about shaping a society where God's character ruled, not human impulse.
And by Exodus 22 and 23, those principles break down into two radical streams.
Love for your neighbor and love for your God.
In Exodus 22 and 23, you will notice a breakdown of the core principles of the law love for God and love for our neighbors into specific case studies or scenarios where temptation, injustice, and worship all collide. For instance, number one, Exodus 22:16 to 23, verse 9 addresses love for our neighbors. One, there are specific regulations against putting down or humiliating people. God did not want any kind of exploitation either. In His mercy, He was setting guardrails against the sinful impulses of the human heart. The vulnerable were to be protected, justice upheld, and society kept safe. Love and fairness had to govern every action.
2. Exodus chapter 23, 10 through 19, addressed ways they were to express their love and allegiance to God. The Sabbath established at creation, Genesis 2:2, 3, Exodus 20, 8 through 11, and the festivals were not random rituals. They were anchors, reminders of creation, of deliverance, and of redemption. Worship wasn't just a side activity. It was the foundation that held every other part of life together.
Do you see the pattern? Freedom was not just about escaping Egypt. It was about learning a new way to live, one where every choice, every relationship, and every act of worship pointed back to God as our Creator, Redeemer, and Lord. But the story does not stop there.
Notice the sequence of events. First, God freed them from slavery. He offered them a covenant relationship. I will be your God, and you will be my people. But before binding them to his law, he seeks their consent to honor their free will. Their response? A resounding yes, and only then did God lay out the terms in one sweeping summary. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. In the same way, love your neighbors as yourself.
This was not just a law, it was a way of life. And to demonstrate the seriousness and perpetuity of this covenant, God Himself would etch it into a stone, a signature written not in ink, but by the very fingers of God.
Think about this. When kings seal decrees, they use signets of gold. But when God sealed his covenant, he used his own finger on tablets of stone. 2 tablets, engraved by the hand of God, delivered to Moses. It was the unshakable symbol that these laws weren't temporary rules, they were eternal principles. And with the covenant sealed, God now revealed his game plan, how he planned to get his people home.
Home? But wasn't the promised land already occupied?
Yes, the Promised Land was already occupied. Pagan nations filled the territory God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16 puts things in perspective, and it reads, "Your descendants will be strangers, enslaved 400 years. Then, in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete."
You are probably secretly thinking, why displace nations already living in the land? Was God being unfair? Maybe just a tiny little bit? Well, Genesis 15, verse 16 gives us a clue and reads, "In the 4th generation, they will return here, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete." For 400 years, God extended grace to the Amorites. Time to turn, time to repent and change. The thing is, grace is never given indefinitely. It is usually a forerunner of judgment. So when grace and mercy is continually snubbed, it makes way for the judgment of God. This is as true then as it is today.
From all indications, these were pagan nations. Yet God will extend grace to them before executing judgment. For the whole earth is mine, declares the Lord. The principle of grace before judgment isn't reserved for a select few or only for believers. It reaches even the unbelievers. Here is the point. If God can extend grace to those far from Him, that difficult colleague, that gossiping neighbor you're this close to knocking out, even that relative who tests your patience all the time, then perhaps we should too.
Back to the original inhabitants of the promised land. 400 years later, they would not budge. On that account, it seems, they would lose their homeland to others. This cause and effect was not exclusive to these pagan nations. Even the Israelites will experience the same fate years later on several occasions when they too got too comfortable and began to walk away from God, breaking their covenant terms with Him.
Point is, Israel may have been chosen by God for a special purpose, but the whole earth still is the Lord's. We are all God's children, Israelite and Amorite, believers and unbelievers alike. We are all the works of His hand, and His discipline is without favoritism.
Back to Sinai. If you were standing in this Sinai crowd, You'll probably be wondering, so how exactly is this gonna play out? We just march into this territory and shout shoo, and the nations just evacuate? That's the game plan?
Well, not quite. Here is the thing. After Israel willingly entered the covenant with God, God revealed his game plan on how to get them situated. You will find the details in Exodus chapter 23, verses 20 through 33. Here is the bottom line. It wasn't Israel's strength that would win the land.
And that is correct. The plan was never for them to fight and conquer. The land was a gift promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was God's to give, not theirs to seize.
So it was not so much about what they had to offer, but what God was willing to do for them if only they will walk with Him faithfully.
Exactly. Their job was to obey. God's job was to deliver, which means victory wasn't about their swords. It was about their surrender.
This audience had witnessed God deliver them with a similar template from the beginning of this journey till date. Remember the Red Sea? Boxed in, Pharaoh charging, panic rising, and then God spoke through Moses: stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And sure enough, the sea split, Pharaoh's army drowned, and Israel walked free. That was not meant to be an isolated event. It was supposed to be a foretaste of what to expect. God had given them enough evidence in these demos.
But wasn't the promised land still conditional?
Yes, just like all other promises of God, it was conditional. Every promise came with a condition of obedience. They had to listen to the angel of the Lord, the one who appeared as a cloud by day and fire by night. Follow him faithfully, and he would lead them in. Ignore him, and the gift could be lost.
So the same principle still stands today. God fights for us, but only if we actually follow where He leads.
And that's the hinge of the whole story: obedience, not legalism, not empty ritual, but a daily choice to trust God's lead over our own instincts.
Obedience wasn't about rituals. It was about living the covenant daily.
That is why, right after giving them the Ten Commandments, God used case studies in Exodus 21 to show them how His law applied to their dailies: family, justice, everyday life, relationships. However, just like in many laws, the problem almost always arises from their interpretation and applications. People are more inclined to twisting the laws to fit cultural or personal preferences. And the outcome are interpretations drifting far away from the original intent. But here is a generic underlying principle of interpretation and application gleaned from Matthew 5 from verse 21. Every interpretation and application of the law or its associated case studies should be driven by the core fundamental principles of the Decalogue that motivated the instructions in the first place: love for God and love for our neighbors. If at any point it deviates from these, we are missing the point.
So the law wasn't just don't do this or do that. It was about expressing love for God and our neighbors in our dailies and preserving justice at the core.
That is correct. Lose that, and the law becomes nothing more than chains. And this was the very battleground where Jesus and the religious leaders clashed centuries later.
This was the major bone of contention between Jesus and the religious leaders all through his life and ministry. By the time Jesus came, the Pharisees and Sadducees had buried God's commands under layers of tradition. Many started with good intentions, but over time, They allowed customs and personal preferences influence their interpretation and application of the laws in ways that reshaped the law until it no longer reflected God's heart. Jesus called it out plainly in Mark 7, verse 7. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions.
That's a chilling thought. Worshipping God, but in vain, because it's based on rules men invented, the interpretation of men instead of what God actually said.
Exactly. And that's why Jesus spent so much time pulling people back to the original intent, the love, the justice, the mercy behind every command.
Because once you strip away the heart of God from the law, all you have left is empty religion. And to prove it, Jesus began reinterpreting the law in a way that shocked his audience, not by abolishing it, but by uncovering its true depth. In Matthew 5, Jesus took the people back to the heart of the law, and his message was crystal clear. I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Then he started unpacking it law by law, case study by case study: murder, adultery, divorce, retaliation. Each time, he contrasted what the people had been taught with what he had originally intended at Sinai. His point: beyond the letters of the law lie the principles that motivated them. If you cling to the letters but miss the principle, you fall into legalism. And that's missing the point entirely.
So Jesus wasn't lowering the bar, he was raising it, showing that the law went deeper than outward behavior.
Exactly. It wasn't just about what you did, but why you did it, and where your heart stood. And then he touched on one of the most controversial case studies of all time: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In Exodus 21:24, he addresses murder, adultery, divorce, and in verse 38, he makes an interesting switch to one of the case studies in Exodus 21:24. The text reads, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth."
Most people interpret that as a green light for revenge, a tit for tat rule. But that's only a surface interpretation exclusively premised on the letters of the law.
How do you know that?
Good question. Well, first, because it does not line up with the principle behind the law: love for God and love for our neighbor. Secondly, it directly contradicts Romans 12, verse 19, which reads, Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.
So, if revenge doesn't fit, then what was God really getting at? Make it make sense.
That right there is the tension. There has to be another interpretation, one that protects justice but still aligns with love. And that's exactly where the next sin takes us to. D, take it over.
Let's begin from a common ground. Wherever there are laws, there has to be ways to enforce them: reward for obedience and consequences for disobedience. The absence of these makes the effect of the law null and void. Succinctly put, a law without consequences is just a suggestion.
The real question is, in whose hands would you rather leave the administration of justice? The offended being blinded by rage and revenge, or an independent and objective judge who weighs the facts? This is the real issue being addressed in this particular case study. It was about stopping people from taking law into their hands. The law was never designed to fuel vengeance, it was designed to restrain it.
So instead of, you hurt me, I'll hurt you back, it was, let the judge evaluate the injury and decide the proper response.
Exactly. In ancient Israel, it was the judge's duty to investigate, confirm the facts, and then apply proportionate justice. At its core, this law was about finding balance, keeping justice from collapsing into blood feuds while preventing vengeance from consuming the community. And Jesus took this principle even further, pushing his listeners to think beyond fairness to radical grace.
The problem was that the teachers of the law in Jesus' time applied this law in a way that opened the door for personal vengeance. By doing so, the principle was taken out of its context and the initial purpose was missed. Consequently, they were defending what the law actually forbade.
Look closer, and you'll see the principle underneath. Justice balanced with mercy. The original intent was to stop vendettas, feuds, and disproportionate retaliation. In practice, judges were meant to weigh injury and prescribe fair compensation or proportionate discipline, not license bloodshed.
And that is why in Matthew 5, Jesus was not tearing down justice, he was clarifying it. Justice is a principle of life. But here's the thing, no individual has the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. That's not justice, that's chaos. And chaos is exactly what God's law was designed to prevent, which is why Jesus raised the bar even higher, calling his followers to move past retaliation into something far more radical.
In the rest of the verses in Matthew 5, Jesus gives his version of interpretation, what exactly he intended when he gave Moses the law. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
Wait, so instead of getting even, Jesus is saying we should go the extra mile?
Exactly. Just in case anyone still thought holding a grudge and waiting for payback was biblical, Jesus shattered that illusion. If your defense has been that eye for an eye gave you permission to settle the score, sorry to burst your bubble. That was never God's intent. The motive behind Jesus' extension of the law was reconciliation, not revenge. Restoration, not retaliation.
Because at the end of the day, God's law was not giving to feed bitterness, it was giving to heal brokenness. And if that sounds extreme, it's because Jesus was pointing his followers to the very heart of the gospel, a love that goes beyond fairness into radical grace. So here is where it all comes together. The law, it was never about shackles. It was about direction, guardrails to keep us from ruin, and a mirror to show us our need. But the mirror can only show the dirt, it cannot wash it away. That is where Jesus steps in. He does not abolish the law, he fulfills it. He does not lower the standard, he raises it, pointing us back to God's original intent, love.
So, in the end, the law points out the cracks, but Jesus provides the cure?
That is exactly the point. Which means every command, every case study, every principle whispered at Sinai was always meant to lead us to Him. And that's the real lesson of Sinai. The mirror shows the need. The Savior provides the cure.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode. Next week, the journey continues in the covenant and the blueprint. You don't want to miss that. Until then, stay humble, stay teachable, and as always, I remain your Sabasco doodle, doodling out. Let's keep making it make sense one study at a time.
If today's message stirred even a whisper in your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs a faith boost. And hey, if you haven't yet made that life-changing decision to follow Christ, the invitation is still open. Don't wait, the clock is ticking, and grace is calling. Remember, we weren't born just to survive and pay bills. We're still auditioning to reign in heaven. No retreat, no surrender.